There is a version of you that you have not looked at in a long time. Not the version you show to other people. Not the version that shows up at work, or smiles at dinner, or sends the right messages at the right time. Not the version that has the answers, or pretends to have the answers, or quietly convinces itself that everything is basically fine. There is another version, quieter, older, more honest, and somewhere inside you, you already know it's there. You have known it for a while. Maybe you have caught a glimpse of it late at night, when the noise of the day finally settles and the room gets quiet and something rises in you that you would rather not look at. Maybe you have felt it in the middle of a conversation, when a part of you observes what you are saying and knows, deep down, that it isn't quite true. Maybe you have felt it in the space between one choice and another, in that thin moment before you reach for the distraction, before you pick up your phone, before you say the thing that ends the silence. You have felt it, and you have moved away from it. This is not a judgment. This is just what people do. Most of us spend years, sometimes decades, keeping a careful distance from ourselves. Not because we are weak, not because we are broken, but because looking honestly at yourself is uncomfortable in a way that is hard to describe and even harder to sit with. It asks something of you that busy life does not usually reward. And so we keep moving, we stay busy, we stay focused on the next thing and the next thing. We solve problems and make plans and occupy ourselves with an endless stream of tasks that all feel urgent. We tell ourselves we will reflect later, we will slow down eventually, we will sit with the hard questions when there is more time, when things are less complicated, when life feels more stable, but later keeps moving forward. And the things we are not looking at do not disappear. They just go quiet for a while. They wait. This audiobook is about what happens when the waiting ends. It is about what happens when you stop running from yourself and turn around. When you stop filling the silence and let it speak. When you stop explaining your patterns and start seeing them clearly. When you stop defending who you have been and begin to understand who you actually are. This is not a comfortable process. It is not meant to be, but it is honest. And honesty, even when it is difficult, is where everything real begins. You have probably noticed something by now, a sense that things keep repeating in your life, a feeling that you make the same choices in different clothes, that you arrive at the same emotional places through different roads, that the problems change, but the underlying H stays the same. Maybe it is in your relationships. Maybe it is in the way you respond to pressure. Maybe it is in the voice inside your head that speaks to you in the same tone it always has, telling you the same things it has always told you. You have noticed. But noticing is not the same as facing. Facing yourself means something more than noticing. It means staying with what you see long enough to let it be real. It means resisting the urge to explain it away, to justify it, to reframe it into something more comfortable. It means looking at the full picture, not just the parts that make sense or the parts that cast you in a favorable light. It means being honest with yourself when honesty costs something. And it does cost something. That is why most people never quite get there. Not because they lack the desire, but because the moment they get close to something real, something uncomfortable rises and they turn away. They get busy. They get distracted. They redirect their attention to something safer. The pull toward avoidance is one of the most powerful forces in a human life. It is not laziness. It is not stupidity. It is a deeply intelligent system designed to protect you from pain. But protection and growth are not always the same thing. What protects you in the short term can trap you in the long term. And what feels like safety in the moment can become a very comfortable prison over time. This audiobook is an invitation to walk toward the thing you have been walking away from. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that breaks you down, but in a calm, clear, honest way that gives you back something you may not have known you were missing. Yourself. The real one. The full one. the one that exists underneath the performance and the protection and the stories you have been telling for so long that they feel like facts. There is something waiting for you on the other side of honesty. Something that cannot be found any other way. You do not have to be perfect to begin. You do not have to have it figured out. You do not have to have already done the work. You just have to be willing to look. Are you willing to look? Chapter 1. The comfort of avoidance. Before we go any further, there is something important to understand. Avoidance is not a character flaw. It is not something that happens to weak people or unaware people or people who are not trying hard enough. Avoidance is something that happens to almost everyone, in one form or another, because it works. That is the part that people do not always acknowledge. Avoidance works, at least in the short term, at least in the way that matters most in the moment, which is that it reduces discomfort. When something uncomfortable rises in you, and you look away from it, the discomfort eases. When you distract yourself from a difficult truth, the sharpness of that truth softens. When you stay busy instead of sitting quietly with a feeling you would rather not have, the feeling becomes more distant, more manageable, more theoretical, and the brain notices this. It learns from it. It begins to understand that discomfort can be reduced through redirection, and so it becomes very good at redirecting. It becomes creative about it. It finds new and sophisticated ways to keep you occupied, to keep you moving, to keep you facing outward rather than inward. This is not a flaw in you. It is a feature of being human. The problem is not that you have learned to avoid discomfort. The problem is that discomfort is not always the enemy. Sometimes the discomfort you are avoiding is the exact feeling that holds the most important information about your life. Think about it this way. When something hurts inside you, that hurt is usually pointing somewhere. It is pointing at something that matters, something that is unresolved, something that needs your attention. The discomfort is not random, it is meaningful. It is the internal version of a signal that says, "Look here, there is something here." But when you learn to avoid discomfort, you also learn to avoid the signal. You get very good at not looking where the signal is pointing, and so the thing that needs your attention stays unattended. It does not disappear. It does not resolve itself. It just waits underneath the surface, occasionally sending up signals that you have also learned to redirect. This is how years pass. This is how patterns persist for so long that they start to feel like personality. This is how people arrive at middle age or older and feel a strange disconnection from themselves, a sense of not quite knowing who they are underneath everything they have built, a quiet ache that they cannot fully name. They have been very good at not looking for a very long time. But before we go further into what avoidance costs, let us take a moment to understand it more fully. Because understanding avoidance with compassion is the beginning of releasing it. Avoidance begins early. Most people learn avoidance before they are old enough to have a word for it. They learn it in their earliest environments, in the way the people around them responded to difficult emotions, in the messages they received about what was safe to feel and what was not safe to feel, in the moments when being honest about what they were experiencing created more pain rather than less. Some people grew up in environments where vulnerability was met with criticism, where showing uncertainty was treated as weakness, where admitting you were struggling was followed by dismissal or judgment, or an escalation of the very pressure they were already struggling with. Others grew up in environments that were simply overwhelmed, where the adults around them were managing so much of their own unresolved pain that there was no space for the child's pain to be held carefully, not because anyone was cruel, but because everyone was already full. And so the child learned. They learned that some feelings were not welcome. They learned that honesty about inner experience could cost something. They learned that it was safer, often, to push things down, to keep going, to manage alone, to not burden anyone with what was happening inside. That child grew up. But the learning did not go away. The protective strategies that made sense at 6 years old, at 12 years old, at 17 years old, became automatic, became habitual, became so deeply integrated into the way you move through the world that you stopped experiencing them as choices. They just became the way things are. And when something difficult arises now, those old strategies activate before you even realize they are activating. Before you have consciously decided anything, the redirection has already begun. The distraction is already in your hand. The subject has already changed. The feeling has already been labeled something safer and set aside. This is why self-avoidance can be so difficult to see. It is not experienced as avoidance. It is experienced as perfectly reasonable behavior. It is experienced as priorities and preferences and just the way you are. And in some way, it is the way you are. It is a deeply ingrained pattern. But it is not the whole of who you are. It is not the deepest truth of who you are. It is a strategy, an old one that made sense once and has stayed long past the time it needed to. There is another layer to this worth naming. Avoidance often comes dressed as something else. It comes dressed as practicality, as productivity, as focus. It comes dressed as being a private person, or a logical person, or a person who just does not dwell on things. It comes dressed as strength. And this particular disguise is very effective. Because if you believe that not looking at hard things is a form of strength, then you will be very resistant to anyone who suggests you look at hard things. You will experience the invitation to self-reflection as an attack, as an attempt to weaken you or destabilize you or make you less effective. But real strength is not the absence of self-awareness. Real strength is what becomes possible when you are honest about what is actually happening inside you. Real strength is built on a foundation of truth, not on a foundation of avoidance. The second kind is not strength at all. It is endurance. It is getting through. It is keeping the surface intact while something more essential slowly erodes underneath. You can endure a very long time without ever facing yourself, but you cannot grow. Growth requires honesty. And honesty requires you to look at the parts of yourself that are easier not to look at. That is where this audiobook is taking you. Not to destroy anything, not to expose you, not to make you feel worse about yourself than you already do, but to give you the opportunity to see what is actually there. Because only what you can see can be changed, and only what you can change can become something new. The comfort of avoidance is real, but it is a comfort with a price, and you have been paying that price for longer than you may realize. Chapter 2. The moment of realization. There is a moment, not always loud, not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it happens in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday when nothing in particular is wrong, and yet something inside you shifts. Something you have been holding in a certain position for a very long time finally moves, and the movement changes everything you can see. This is the moment of realization. It does not always announce itself the way you might expect. You might imagine that the moment you finally see yourself clearly would feel like a revelation, like something opening or breaking through. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it arrives like a sudden light in a dark room, and everything comes into sharp, unexpected focus. But more often, it is quieter than that. More like a slow leak than a sudden flood. More like a gradual brightening than a single switch. More like something that has always been true finally becoming unavoidable rather than something new being discovered. One day you notice a pattern you have never let yourself name before. One day you hear yourself say something and recognize, with a clarity that is almost physical, that you have been saying that same thing for years and it has never been true. One day someone says something to you, or looks at you in a particular way, and something in you does not rush to deflect or explain. It just quietly acknowledges, yes, that is right. That is a real thing. And in that quiet acknowledgement, something begins. Realization is not comfortable. Let us be clear about that. The moment you begin to see yourself clearly is often followed immediately by a strong desire to stop seeing yourself clearly. Because what you see is not always what you hope to see. Sometimes what you see is the gap between who you believed yourself to be and who you have actually been. Sometimes what you see is a pattern so consistent, so pervasive, so clearly yours, that you cannot pretend any longer that it is circumstance, or bad luck, or other people's fault. Sometimes what you see is the cost of your own choices, the ways your behavior has shaped your relationships, your opportunities, your sense of self. The ways the things you have avoided knowing have still found ways to make themselves felt. This is disorienting. It can feel like the ground is shifting under you. And the immediate instinct when the ground shifts is to find something solid to grab onto, to stabilize, to explain, to reframe, to tell a new story that puts things back in a familiar order. This is the moment where most people stop, not because they are not brave enough, not because they do not care, but because the discomfort of real self-awareness is intense enough in that moment that finding something to hold on to feels like the most important thing in the world. And so they find something, a justification, a counter-narrative, a reason why what they just saw was not quite right, not entirely accurate, not the full picture. And just like that, the realization closes. The window that opened for a moment goes shut again. But there is a different possibility, one that is harder at first, but more valuable in the long run, the possibility of staying with the discomfort of what you are seeing, not rushing to fix it or explain it, not immediately asking what you should do about it, just allowing it to be real for a moment, allowing yourself to look at it without flinching, allowing it to settle into something you can actually work with rather than something you are constantly managing. Staying is not passive. It is one of the most active things you can do. It requires that you resist every instinct that is pulling you away. It requires that you keep your attention on the thing that is uncomfortable rather than the many, many other places your attention wants to go. It requires a kind of steadiness that most people have never practiced, because most people have spent their lives getting very good at moving away rather than staying. So what does it actually look like to stay with a realization? It looks like sitting with a feeling without immediately trying to change it. It looks like noticing a thought about yourself without immediately arguing with it or agreeing with it, just letting it exist and observing what it contains. It looks like asking yourself a question and then actually waiting for the honest answer, rather than accepting the first answer that arrives, which is usually the most comfortable one. It looks like pausing in the middle of a familiar story and asking, is this actually what happened? Or is this what I needed to believe happened? It looks like being willing to not know, to not have an explanation, to sit in the uncertainty of a real question without rushing to a false resolution. This is not easy, but it is important, because the realization that stays with you, the one you do not run from, is the one that actually changes something. There is a particular quality to the moment of genuine self-awareness that is worth describing, because it is different from the kind of self-awareness that is really just self-criticism wearing a different coat. Real self-awareness is not a judgment. It is an observation. When you truly see something about yourself, there is a quality of neutrality to it, a quality of, this is what is here. Not, this is terrible, or this is unforgivable, or this means I am broken. Just, this is what is here. This is what is happening. This is the pattern. This is what I have been doing. This is what I have not been saying. This is what I have been avoiding. That quality of neutral clarity is very different from shame. And it is important to understand the difference, because shame actually prevents genuine self-awareness rather than producing it. When you feel shame, you are not looking clearly at yourself. You are looking at an image of yourself that has been filtered through self-judgment. And self-judgment is another form of avoidance. It feels like accountability. It feels like you are being hard on yourself, being rigorous, taking it seriously. But what it actually does is collapse your attention into a painful feeling about yourself rather than a clear observation of yourself. Shame says, "I am bad." Awareness says, "I did this," or "I have been doing this," or "This is a pattern I am now able to see." One of those statements opens a door, the other closes one. The moment of realization that actually leads somewhere is the one where you can be a witness to yourself, where you can observe your own patterns, your own behaviors, your own thoughts, with the same steady attention you might bring to observing something outside yourself. Not cold, not clinical, but clear. That clarity is rare, and when it arrives, it is worth protecting, worth not rushing away from, worth not immediately covering with noise or justification, worth sitting in, even when it is uncomfortable, even when everything in you wants to move. Because that moment of clarity, that moment of genuine self-awareness, is the beginning of something that nothing else can begin. It is the beginning of actual change, not the kind of change that looks like change from the outside while the inside stays exactly the same. Not the kind of change that involves rearranging the furniture of your life while the underlying structure stays untouched. Not the kind of change that is really just a new strategy for managing the same unresolved things. The actual change. The kind that goes all the way down. That kind of change only becomes possible when you can see what actually needs to change. And you can only see what actually needs to change when you are willing to look honestly at what is actually there. This is what the moment of realization offers you. Not an answer, not a solution, not a roadmap, just a clear view, just honest ground to stand on, just the beginning. Now, some realizations arrive suddenly, and some arrive slowly. Some feel like a light being switched on in a dark room, and some feel like a slow dawn that takes years to fully brighten. Both are valid. Both are real. There is no correct speed for coming to know yourself more honestly. What matters is not how quickly you arrive at clarity, but what you do when it comes, because clarity will come. It always does, eventually. The question is whether you will be ready to receive it. Some people find that realization arrives in the wake of loss, the end of a relationship, a failure, a period of illness or exhaustion that strips away the usual distractions. Something that forces a stillness that wouldn't otherwise have come, in the space left behind by loss or difficulty, or the sudden absence of something that used to fill the days. Something true often surfaces. Others find that realization arrives in therapy, or in a quiet conversation with someone who genuinely sees them, or in the pages of something they are reading that suddenly feels like it was written specifically for them. Others find it alone, in the early morning or the late night, when the defense systems are lower and something true gets through. And some people find it here, in a moment of quiet listening, in a voice that asks them to stay rather than run. Wherever it arrives, let it in. Do not be in a hurry to make it into something useful. Do not rush to extract the lesson and move on. Do not immediately translate what you are seeing into a plan of action, because action will come in its own time. For now, just let the realization be a realization. Let the clarity be clarity. Let yourself see. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is the first real thing. Chapter 3. Seeing your patterns. Clearly, patterns are the fingerprints of your inner life. They are the shapes your experience takes, again and again, in response to the world. They are not accidents. They are not coincidences. They are the external expression of internal structures that have been built over years, reinforced through repetition, and made automatic through use. When you begin to see your patterns clearly, you begin to see yourself clearly. Not the surface version of yourself, the one that is responsive and situational and changes depending on who is in the room. The deeper version, the one that moves through different situations and different relationships, but keeps arriving at the same places. This is one of the most important things you can do for yourself, and it is one of the most unsettling. Because patterns, once you can see them, have a relentlessness to them that is hard to look at. They reveal something about your life that is at once deeply personal and deeply repetitive. They show you that you are not as varied or as unpredictable as you may have believed. That the drama and the difference of your experience, the different people, the different circumstances, the feeling of things always being new and complicated in new ways, has been built on a foundation that does not change very much at all. Most of us resist seeing this. It can feel diminishing. It can feel like it reduces the complexity of your life to something mechanical, like it takes away the narrative of your experience and replaces it with something less interesting, less meaningful. But this is not what pattern recognition does. Understanding your patterns does not make your life smaller. It makes it more navigable. It gives you information that nothing else can give you. It shows you where the work actually is. So let us talk about what patterns look like and how they operate. A pattern is a repeated way of responding. It could be emotional, a specific emotional reaction that arises in specific types of situations, regardless of the particular details. It could be behavioral, a specific set of actions you tend to take when you are feeling a certain way. It could be relational, a specific dynamic that you tend to recreate in your closest relationships with different people but the same essential shape. It could be cognitive, a specific type of thought that arises when you face certain challenges, a specific story you tell yourself about yourself or others or the world. Patterns are specific and they are consistent, and when you are inside one, you often cannot see it. It just feels like life. It just feels like what is happening right now, this particular situation, this particular person, this particular problem. But when you take a step back, when you create enough distance to see the shape rather than just the content, the pattern becomes visible. You have had this feeling before. You have been in this situation before. You have responded this way before. You have ended up here before. Seeing that is important. Staying with it long enough to understand it is even more important. One of the most common patterns is the pattern of disconnection. This is when your outward behavior and your inner experience are consistently different from each other. When you say you are fine when you are not fine, when you move through situations calmly on the surface, while something very different is happening underneath. When you consistently present one version of yourself while another version goes unacknowledged, unspoken, unattended to. This pattern often begins as protection. There are environments, relationships, situations where showing what is really happening inside you is not safe, where it invites criticism or minimization or something worse. And so you learn to keep the inside separate from the outside. You learn to function on two levels simultaneously. Over time, this becomes automatic, and at some point, the two levels become so disconnected that you may not even know, in a given moment, what the inner level is actually doing. You have learned to move through life at the surface level so effectively that the deeper level has become inaccessible. This is not weakness. This is a very effective adaptation to a difficult environment, but it is an adaptation that carries a cost. It creates a kind of chronic low-level exhaustion. It creates an inability to feel fully present even in moments that should feel meaningful. It creates a sense of being slightly outside your own life, watching rather than living, and it creates a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of not being fully known, even by yourself. Another common pattern is the pattern of people pleasing. This is when your choices are consistently shaped more by the perceived needs or expectations of others than by your own authentic desires and values. When you say yes when you mean no, when you shape your opinions to match the room, when your sense of your own worth is closely tied to whether others seem satisfied with you. This pattern, too, usually begins early. It begins in environments where love or approval or safety were conditional, where getting needs met required being a certain way, performing a certain role, managing the emotional landscape of others. The child who learns to read the room, who learns to modulate their behavior based on what will keep the adults calm or pleased or approving, grows up with this pattern deeply embedded. And as an adult, it shows up everywhere, in relationships where you consistently put others first at your own expense, in professional settings where you struggle to advocate for your own needs or push back against expectations, in the quiet exhaustion of always managing how others see you while losing track of how you actually see yourself. The pattern of people pleasing looks like kindness from the outside. It is often mistaken for generosity, for selflessness, for social grace. And sometimes those things are present. But underneath the surface, it is usually operating as a survival strategy rather than a genuine expression of care. And the cost is a life that feels increasingly hollow because it has been built around others' approval rather than around your own truth. There is also the pattern of self-sabotage. This one is perhaps the most mysterious to people who experience it, because from the inside, it does not feel like self-sabotage. It feels like bad luck or poor timing or circumstances that are always slightly against you. It feels like you get close to something good and then something happens, something outside you or something you cannot quite explain, and the good thing falls apart. But when you look at it as a pattern, something else becomes visible. A way of making choices, just at the critical moment, that undermine what you have been building. A way of introducing conflict just when things are becoming close or settled. A way of not quite following through on the exact thing that would have made the difference. Self-sabotage is usually the expression of something that has not yet been faced. A belief about yourself that says you do not deserve the good thing. A fear of what having the good thing would mean, of the vulnerability it would require, of the exposure of being seen succeeding rather than struggling. An old familiar feeling of unworthiness that, however painful, is at least familiar, more comfortable than the unfamiliar discomfort of actually having what you want. Seeing a pattern like this in yourself is difficult. It requires you to hold a kind of double vision, to see both the surface level, where things just seem to go wrong, and the deeper level, where choices are being made for reasons that have not been consciously examined. But once you can see it, once you can hold both levels in view without collapsing into shame or defensiveness, something remarkable happens. The pattern loses some of its power, because the pattern operates best in the dark. It operates best when it is invisible, when its mechanisms are below the threshold of your awareness, when you are fully inside it without knowing you are inside it. When you can see it, you are no longer entirely inside it. You are in a new relationship with it. You are watching it rather than being it, and watching is the beginning of choice. Let us also talk about relational patterns. These are perhaps the most powerful patterns in a human life, because relationships are the domain where our deepest unresolved material tends to surface. The people we are drawn to, the dynamics we recreate, the emotional choreography we perform again and again, these things are not random. They are shaped by everything we learned about connection and safety and love in our earliest experiences. You may have noticed that you keep ending up in relationships with a particular type of person, or that you keep taking on a particular role in relationships. The caretaker, the one who is needed, the one who holds things together, the one who is always slightly outside, or that the same emotional dynamic appears again and again with different faces attached to it. This is not about blaming the past. It is not about identifying what was done to you and using it as an explanation for everything. It is about seeing the shape of what you carry and understanding how that shape creates certain kinds of encounters over others. The relational patterns that run deepest are the ones most worth looking at. Not to assign blame, but to understand, and in understanding, to begin the slow work of choosing something different. Seeing your patterns clearly requires a particular kind of honesty that takes practice. It requires you to be able to say, I did that, not as an accusation against yourself, not as a reason to feel shame, but as a simple observation, a clear-eyed recognition of what is yours. It requires you to resist the very human instinct to make it about something or someone outside yourself, to resist the pull of the story where you are only ever responding to circumstances, where your choices are always reactions rather than initiations, where your patterns are the result of what happened to you rather than the expression of what is happening in you. It requires you to be curious rather than defensive, to approach what you discover about yourself with the spirit of someone who genuinely wants to understand rather than someone who is bracing for an attack. And it requires time. Patterns that have operated for years do not become visible all at once. They reveal themselves gradually through repeated observation, through accumulated moments of recognition, through the slow building of a picture that becomes clearer as more of its pieces fall into place. Be patient with this process. You are not looking for a quick diagnosis. You are developing a relationship with the truth of your own life. And that relationship, like all real ones, takes time to build. Chapter 4. Acceptance before change. This is where many people make the mistake. They see the pattern. They recognize the behavior. They understand, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, what has been happening inside them and why. And immediately, almost before the recognition has finished arriving, they move to fix it, change it, correct it, eliminate it, make it stop. And this impulse, this urgent desire to immediately transform what you have just seen is understandable. It comes from a good place. It comes from the recognition that what you have been doing has not been serving you. That you want to do something different. That you are ready to be different, but it runs ahead of something that cannot be skipped. Acceptance. This word is misunderstood more than almost any other word in the language of personal growth. People hear it and think it means resignation, passive acceptance, deciding that what is fine, that nothing needs to change, that you are simply going to accept yourself exactly as you are and stop trying. That is not what acceptance means. Acceptance means something much more specific and much more active. It means allowing what is true to be true, without resistance, without the additional layer of fight or denial or shame that usually surrounds our most difficult truths. Acceptance is not agreement. It is not approval. It is not surrender. It is the act of looking at something clearly, seeing it for what it is, and staying present with it, without immediately trying to make it into something else. And acceptance is the foundation on which a real change is built. Here is why. When you resist what is true about yourself, when you fight against it, argue with it, try to suppress it, or deny it or transform it by willpower alone, you are in a relationship with it that keeps it very much alive. Resistance is not the opposite of a thing. Resistance is a relationship with a thing, and relationships maintain connection. When you are in a constant state of fighting against an aspect of yourself, you are giving that aspect an enormous amount of your attention and energy. You are constantly engaged with it. You are, in a strange way, organized around it. Your life, your choices, your emotional state are all shaped in part by this ongoing battle with something you refuse to acknowledge as actually being there. This is exhausting, and it does not work. The pattern does not disappear because you are fighting it. It goes underground. It becomes more subtle. It finds new routes. It waits for you to relax your vigilance, which you must eventually do, because no one can maintain that level of vigilance forever. And then it resurfaces, often in exactly the same form as before, sometimes in a new form that is harder to recognize because it looks different on the surface, even though it is doing the same thing underneath. Resistance does not eliminate patterns. It drives them deeper. Acceptance, on the other hand, brings them up into the light. And in the light is where real work can happen. When you accept something about yourself, truly accept it, you are not saying it is good or that you want to keep it. You are saying, this is real. This is here. This is part of what I am working with. Let me look at it fully, without the distortion of shame or the noise of resistance, and understand what is actually happening. And from that place of clear seeing, from that place of honest acknowledgement, real change becomes possible. Not the frantic, white-knuckled kind of change that is really just a more aggressive form of resistance. The grounded, sustainable, genuine kind that comes from understanding rather than from force. Let us think about what resistance actually looks like in practice, because it is not always obvious. It does not always look like denial or anger. Sometimes it looks like very busy self-improvement. There is a version of working on yourself that is really a form of resistance in disguise. It is the version where you are always in motion, always consuming new ideas and new techniques and new frameworks for change, always in the middle of the next transformation and the next, where the activity of improvement becomes its own kind of avoidance, where being in process becomes a way of not arriving anywhere, because arriving somewhere means having to be there, means having to sit still with what is actually true right now, in this moment, with this version of yourself that exists before all the work is done. And that is the thing that real acceptance asks of you. It asks you to be with what is actually true right now, before it is fixed, before it is better, before you have done the work. This is uncomfortable in a way that is hard to describe, but very easy to recognize. There is a particular quality to the discomfort of genuine acceptance. It is not the sharp discomfort of shame, which is painful and hot and makes you want to hide. It is a quieter discomfort, more like grief than pain, more like something settling than something breaking. It is the discomfort of being seen, of seeing yourself, without the usual protective layers, without the story that makes you the hero of your own narrative, or the story that makes you the victim, or the story that makes it all more complicated than it actually is. Just the truth, just what is actually there. And sitting with that truth, allowing it to be what it is an act of profound courage. It does not look like courage from the outside. It does not look dramatic or heroic. It looks like a person sitting quietly with something difficult and not running from it. But it is one of the most courageous things a person can do. There is also something important to understand about the relationship between acceptance and compassion. Real acceptance of yourself requires a certain quality of compassion, not sentimentality, not making excuses, not performing kindness toward yourself while really just avoiding accountability. Real compassion is more like understanding. It is the capacity to see yourself as a human being who arrived here through a particular history, shaped by particular experiences, operating with a particular set of beliefs and defenses that developed for reasons that made sense at the time. You did not choose your earliest conditioning. You did not choose the environment in which you learned what was safe and what was not, what was acceptable and what was not, what you needed to suppress and what you were allowed to express. You moved through a world that shaped you in specific ways, and those shapes became your patterns. That does not mean you are not responsible for what you do now. We will talk more about responsibility in a later section. But it means that the patterns you carry are not evidence of your fundamental badness or brokenness. They are evidence of your humanity, of the intelligent adaptations a human being makes to the conditions they find themselves in. Understanding this does not remove your agency. It actually increases it. Because when you can see where your patterns came from, when you can understand them in the context of your actual history, rather than just judging them as failures of character, you can be in a more honest and more productive relationship with them. You can say, I understand why I do this, and I am also choosing to do something different. That combination, understanding and choice, is very different from the combination of self-judgment and forced change. It is more durable, it is more kind, and it is more effective. Acceptance also changes the way you relate to the parts of yourself that are most uncomfortable. The parts that feel most shameful or most frightening, or most out of alignment with who you want to be. When those parts are met with judgment, they go into hiding. They do not disappear, but they become less visible, which means they are also less workable. They operate in the dark. When those parts are met with honest acceptance, they can come into the light. And in the light, they can be seen for what they actually are, which is often much less monstrous than you feared. Often just old pain doing its best to protect something tender. Often just old strategies that outlived their usefulness but were never given permission to retire. This is not about loving everything about yourself. It is not about celebrating every pattern or every choice. It is about being willing to know yourself fully, to include all of yourself in your own attention, to stop editing out the parts that do not fit the image. Because when you can include all of yourself, when nothing has to be hidden from your own awareness, something relaxes. Something that has been held in a state of vigilance, of constant management, of effortful containment, finally gets to set down the weight. And in that setting down, something new has room to begin. Acceptance is not the end of the work. It is not even the hardest part of the work, though it can feel like it. But it is the only real beginning. Everything that comes before it, the recognition, the awareness, the seeing of patterns, all of that is preparation. The actual transformation begins here, in the willingness to let yourself be real, in the willingness to look at what is true and say, quietly, without drama, yes, this is true. I see it. I accept that it is real, and now I can work with it. Chapter 5. Taking responsibility. There is a shift that happens when acceptance has had time to settle. The initial discomfort of seeing clearly starts to ease. Not because what you have seen has changed, but because you have stopped fighting it. You have let it be real. You have allowed the truth to take up the space it actually occupies, rather than the smaller space you were trying to contain it in. And in that easing, something else becomes possible. Something that is often more difficult than recognition, more difficult even than acceptance. Personal responsibility. This word carries a lot of weight. It has been misused in ways that have made it harder for many people to approach it with openness. It has been used as a cudgel, as a way of telling people that their suffering is their own fault, that the circumstances of their lives are entirely the product of their choices, that anything difficult they experience is something they have brought on themselves. That is not what responsibility means. That version is not responsibility. That version is blame wearing the mask of accountability. Real personal responsibility is something different. It is quieter. It is more specific. And it is, in the end, one of the most empowering things you can take on. Real personal responsibility is simply this: the honest acknowledgement of the role you play in your own experience. Not the role you play in everything. Not the claim that you control all outcomes or that everything in your life is a direct result of your choices. The world is more complicated than that. Things happen to people. Circumstances shape lives. Luck, both good and bad, is real. But within all of that, within all the complexity and circumstance and things outside your control, there is a portion that is yours. There are choices that are yours. There are responses that are yours. There are patterns that are yours to work with, yours to change, yours to own. Taking responsibility means being willing to see that portion clearly, without inflating it into everything, which becomes self-blame, and without minimizing it into nothing, which becomes the kind of victimhood that keeps people stuck. Let us talk about what happens when responsibility is not taken. Because the alternative to responsibility is something that many people live inside for years without recognizing it. The alternative to responsibility is a particular story about your life. A story in which you are always responding, in which the events of your life are things that happen to you, and your behavior is always a reaction to those events, and your patterns are explainable by the things other people did or the circumstances you were handed. This story is not entirely wrong. Parts of it are true, Things do happen to you. Others do affect you. Circumstances do shape your experience in real ways. But the story is incomplete, and in its incompleteness, it has a particular cost. It costs you agency. It costs you the experience of yourself as someone who moves through the world with intention, who makes choices that matter, who is capable of shaping their own experience. And when agency is absent, change becomes impossible. Because change requires agency. It requires the belief that what you do, that the choices you make, that the patterns you engage with or decline to engage with actually matter, actually affect something. When everything is attributed to outside forces, this belief erodes. You end up in a world where things are always happening to you, and the only stance available is endurance. Endurance is not the same as living. Responsibility gives you your agency back, not by claiming you control everything, but by acknowledging that you control something, and that something matters. So what does taking responsibility actually look like in the context of everything you have been doing in this audiobook? In the context of the awareness you have been building, the patterns you have begun to see, the acceptance you have been moving toward. It looks like this. It looks like being able to say, without drama and without excessive self-punishment, I have been doing this. And this thing I have been doing has had consequences, not just for me, but sometimes for others. And I am the one who needs to work with this, because this is mine. It looks like being able to look at a relationship that has not been working and ask honestly, what part of what has not been working is mine? Not entirely mine, not only mine, but mine. It looks like being able to look at a pattern you have been blaming on circumstances or on other people and ask, what is my role in this? How am I contributing to the continuation of this pattern? It looks like being able to stop the internal story just long enough to see the mechanism clearly, to see how your responses, your defenses, your habitual ways of engaging with certain situations are not neutral. They are not just reactions to what is happening. They are also inputs that shape what continues to happen. This is not about harsh self-judgment. Everything said earlier about acceptance still applies. You can hold yourself accountable with compassion. You can own your role in your own life without beating yourself up for it. In fact, the presence of self-compassion is what makes real accountability possible. Because if taking responsibility feels like it will destroy you, you will not do it. If it feels like a verdict rather than a description, you will fight it. You will find reasons why it is not quite right, not entirely accurate, not the full picture. But if you can approach it from a place of settled self-acceptance, if you can acknowledge what is yours from a stable enough foundation that the acknowledgement does not destabilize your entire sense of self, then you can hold it clearly and work with it honestly. You can say, I see this. It is mine. I am going to do something different with it. There is also something about the quality of attention that is available when you take responsibility that is worth naming. When you are in the blame story, when your experience is always the result of what others did or what circumstances dictated, your attention is constantly oriented outward. You are always watching what others are doing, always analyzing what is coming at you, always in a state of vigilance about the external environment. This is exhausting, and it keeps you from the work that is actually available to you. When you take responsibility, your attention turns inward, not in a self-absorbed way, not in a way that makes you oblivious to the external, but in a way that allows you to work with what is actually workable, which is yourself, your responses, your choices, your patterns. This is where your power is. This is where change actually lives. No one else can do this work for you. No amount of external change, no change in circumstance or relationship or environment can substitute for this work, because the pattern that operates in one context will simply find a new context to operate in if the underlying structure is not addressed. You have probably seen this in your own life. The relationship that ended because of certain dynamics and then the next relationship developed the same dynamics. The job that became untenable for certain reasons, and then the next one developed those same reasons. The situation you escaped, and then somehow found yourself in again, wearing different clothes. This is not bad luck. This is a pattern looking for a place to land. Taking responsibility is the act of saying, I see the pattern. I understand that it is mine to work with, and I am ready to work with it. Not tomorrow, not when things are easier, not when I have more time or more support or more certainty. Now, with what I have, from where I am. This is where change becomes real, not in the aspiration, not in the plan, but in the moment you stop waiting for circumstances to change and begin changing the thing that is actually within your reach. Yourself. Chapter 6. The beginning of real change. Change does not begin the way most people imagine it. Most people imagine change as a sudden shift, a dramatic before and after, a moment of decision followed by a new way of being that simply replaces the old one, a clean break. That is not how change works, or at least, that is not how the kind of change that actually lasts works. Real change begins with something much smaller, something almost imperceptible, something that does not look like change at all from the outside and barely registers as change even from the inside. It begins with a moment of pause where before there was no pause, a moment of noticing where before there was only automatic movement, a moment of asking where before there was only assuming. These moments are tiny. They are not dramatic, but they are the actual substance of change. They are where the architecture of a different life is built, one small decision at a time, one small moment of awareness at a time. You cannot skip to the finished version of yourself. Nobody can. The finished version, the version that embodies all the changes you want to make, is built through the accumulation of these small moments, through the countless unremarkable instances where you stopped, noticed, and chose differently. This is not discouraging. It is clarifying. It means the work is always available to you. Not in some hypothetical future when you have done enough preparation. Not after you have fully understood everything. Not once you have resolved all the deeper material. Right now. In this conversation. In this feeling. In this automatic response that you just caught yourself about to give. Here. The beginning of real change is always here. One of the most important things to understand about change is that awareness is itself a form of change. Before you were aware of a pattern, it operated with full authority over your behavior. It happened, and you had no experience of it as a choice. It was just what occurred. After you are aware of it, something has already shifted. Not enough to stop the pattern necessarily, at least not immediately, but enough to introduce a small amount of space between the trigger and the response. Enough to make the automatic slightly less automatic. Enough to create the possibility of a different choice, even if in this particular moment you still make the old one. That space, however small, is everything. It is the gap through which something new can enter. This is why the work of awareness, the work of seeing your patterns clearly, accepting them honestly, and taking responsibility for them, is not preliminary to change. It is change, the early stages of it, the foundation of it. Everything you have been doing in this audiobook, the looking, the staying, the seeing, the accepting, has already begun to alter something, even if it does not feel that way yet. Even if the patterns still feel as strong as they ever did, even if you still find yourself making the same choices in familiar situations, something has shifted. Because you are no longer fully inside the pattern, you are in a new relationship with it. You can see it, which means you are not entirely it. And from this new position, real work becomes possible. What does that work look like in practice? It looks like cultivating the pause, getting better and better at noticing the moment just before an automatic response, and introducing a small gap into that moment, not to force a different outcome necessarily, but to allow a moment of honest reflection. What is happening right now? What am I feeling? What is the pattern wanting to do? Is that what I actually want to do? These questions, asked in real time, in the moment of actual experience, are more valuable than any amount of retrospective analysis. They are where the work lives. It looks like being gentle with relapse. Because patterns do not disappear cleanly, they return. You will find yourself doing the thing you intended not to do. You will find yourself back in the familiar emotional place you had resolved to move away from. You will recognize the old response in your behavior and feel frustration or shame or discouragement. This is part of the process, not a failure of the process. The return of a pattern after you have begun to work with it, it is not evidence that the work is not working. It is evidence that the pattern is real and that the work needs to continue. Each time the pattern returns and you recognize it, the recognition itself is the work. Each time you see it with more clarity than you did before, that clarity is progress. Each time you are able to observe it with slightly less judgment and slightly more understanding, something is being built. Consistency of attention is what creates change, not perfection of behavior. It also looks like being honest about what you are choosing and why, not in a performance for anyone else, not in a spirit of self-flagellation, but in a quiet, ongoing practice of truth-telling with yourself, of knowing, in real time, why you are doing what you are doing, of not letting the comfortable story replace the honest one. This is harder than it sounds, because the comfortable story is always available and always faster. It arrives before the honest one. It is fluent and practiced and familiar. The honest one takes a moment longer to surface, requires more stillness to hear, and is often less flattering. But the honest one is the one that actually leads somewhere. The beginning of real change is also the beginning of a new relationship with discomfort. One of the things that becomes possible when you have accepted yourself and your patterns more honestly is a different relationship with the discomfort that comes with doing things differently. Because doing things differently is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable in a way that is distinct from the discomfort of denial or shame. It is the discomfort of the unfamiliar, the discomfort of being in a situation where the old response is available and well-worn and the new response is uncertain and requires more effort and feels slightly awkward. That awkwardness is growth. It is the feeling of building something new. It is not a sign that the new thing is wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something you have not done before. Lean into that discomfort with curiosity rather than resistance. Ask what it contains. Stay with it long enough to learn from it. Let it be part of the process rather than a reason to abandon the process. Real change is not comfortable, but it becomes progressively more natural. The new response that felt awkward and deliberate the first time becomes slightly easier the second time, and slightly easier still the third. And gradually, over time, through repetition and through the accumulation of small moments of choice, it begins to become its own kind of habit. A better one. The work you have been doing in this audiobook, all of it, from the first moment of honest looking to this point, has been laying the foundation for that better habit. Not through transformation by insight alone, not through understanding changing everything immediately, but through the slow, patient, consistent practice of honest attention. That is what real change is made of. Honesty, attention, patience, and the willingness to begin again every time you lose the thread. Chapter 7. Becoming honest with yourself. Honesty with yourself is not a destination you arrive at and then stay in permanently. It is a practice, a daily one, a choice you make again and again, in large moments and small ones, in the obvious situations and the subtle ones, where it would be very easy to tell yourself something just slightly less accurate than the truth. This matters because self-deception, like all deception, is not dramatic. It is not usually a conscious choice to lie to yourself about something important. It is usually much quieter than that. It is the small adjustments in how you describe a situation to yourself, the slightly self-serving framing, the memory that has been edited just a little in your favor. the interpretation that chose the most comfortable of several available readings. These small adjustments accumulate over time. They can add up to a significant gap between what is actually happening in your life and what you believe is happening, between who you actually are and who you tell yourself you are. The practice of ongoing honesty with yourself is the practice of regularly checking that gap, of being willing to look at the gap when it is uncomfortable to look at, of choosing the accurate story over the comfortable one, especially when the difference matters. This is easier said than done, partly because the mind is very skilled at making the comfortable story feel like the accurate one, partly because you live inside your own experience, and living inside something makes it hard to see its shape, and partly because there are real costs to honesty, costs in terms of what you will have to change, what you will have to acknowledge, what you will have to take responsibility for. But the cost of continued self-deception is higher. Let us talk about what ongoing self-honesty actually looks like in a life. It looks like checking your motivations. Not obsessively, not constantly, but honestly. When you are about to do something, asking, why am I actually doing this? Not why is it justifiable, not what is the best possible reason, but why am I actually doing it? What is driving this? Sometimes the answer will be genuinely good. Sometimes it will be genuinely mixed. Sometimes it will be something you would rather not admit. All of those answers are useful, but you can only get to them if you are asking the question honestly rather than looking for confirmation of the answer you prefer. It looks like checking your stories. The narratives you carry about people in your life, about yourself, about the situations you have been through. These narratives tend to solidify over time. They start as interpretations and become, with repetition, facts. They become the official version of what happened, and the official version stops being questioned. Ongoing self-honesty asks you to keep questioning the official version, not to constantly destabilize yourself or to refuse to know anything, but to hold your stories with a degree of openness. To be willing, when the evidence suggests it, to revise them. To be curious about the version that is less comfortable for you to believe. It looks like being honest about what you want. This sounds simple and is actually quite difficult, because we learn early to manage our desires, to want what we are supposed to want, to reshape our authentic preferences around what is expected or approved of. Over time, we can lose track of what we actually want underneath all that management. Being honest about what you want requires accessing something quieter and more genuine than the surface layer of socially acceptable desires. It requires being willing to know things about yourself that complicate the image you have been maintaining. You might want something you have told yourself you should not want. You might want something that would require you to have a difficult conversation or make a significant change or disappoint someone. You might want to stop doing something that you have been framing as important or valuable, but that is actually draining you. These wants are real information. They deserve your honest attention. It looks like being honest about your impact on others, not in a self-punishing way, not in a way that requires constant guilt, but in a way that is willing to see, clearly, when something you have done or said has caused harm or hurt or confusion for someone else, and to acknowledge that clearly rather than immediately rushing to justify it. The instinct to immediately justify, to explain, to contextualize, to make sure your behavior is understandable before it is even acknowledged as having been real. This instinct is very human, but it is also the instinct that keeps you from being able to genuinely repair things, and it keeps you from being able to learn from your impact in a way that actually changes future behavior. Being honest about your impact does not mean accepting every criticism you receive as accurate. It does not mean abandoning your own perspective. It means being genuinely open to the possibility that the effect of your actions was different from your intention, and being curious about that gap rather than defensive about it. It looks like being honest about what is not working in your relationships, in your work, in your habits, in your internal life. There is a particular form of self-deception that is organized around maintaining the belief that things are fundamentally okay when they are not, that the discomfort is temporary, that the problem will resolve itself, that you do not really need to address this particular thing because it will sort itself out in time. Sometimes things do resolve themselves, but usually the things that are not working keep not working until something changes. And the longer you tell yourself they are basically okay, the longer they stay exactly as they are. Being honest about what is not working is not the same as catastrophizing. It is not saying that things are terrible or that they cannot be changed. It is simply being willing to accurately assess the current state of things, to see what is actually happening rather than what you wish were happening. From that accurate assessment, actual decisions can be made. Actual changes can begin. Honesty with yourself is also, deeply, a form of respect for yourself. When you tell yourself comfortable untruths, when you manage your self-perception to protect yourself from difficult realities, you are treating yourself as someone who cannot handle the truth, as someone too fragile or too limited to work with what is actually real. You are not that person. You are capable of more truth than you usually allow yourself, more uncertainty, more ambiguity. The capacity to hold difficult things about yourself without being destroyed by them is greater than you may have experienced, because you have rarely given yourself the opportunity to test it. The work of this audiobook has been building that capacity. Through the practice of looking, of staying, of accepting, of taking responsibility, through the slow building of a relationship with yourself that is honest enough to include the hard parts, you are more capable of honesty than you know. And honesty is not the enemy of peace. It is not the enemy of feeling good about yourself. This is perhaps the most important misconception to address, because it is the one that keeps people most thoroughly stuck in comfortable self-deception. People believe that knowing the truth about themselves, the full truth, including the difficult parts, will make them feel worse, will decrease their confidence or their self-esteem or their sense of their own worth. But this is backwards. The self-respect that comes from honest self-knowledge is far more durable than the comfort that comes from managed self-perception. When you know yourself clearly, including your flaws and your patterns and your difficult histories, and you accept yourself with that full knowledge, you are standing on solid ground. You are not living in fear of being found out. You are not defending a story that requires constant maintenance. You are just yourself, with full knowledge of what that means and without shame about it. That is a different kind of freedom. It is the freedom that comes from not hiding, from not managing, from not needing the story to stay intact. It is the freedom of actually being here in your own life as your actual self. That freedom is available to you. It has always been available to you. It has been waiting on the other side of the very thing you have been avoiding. Yourself. Chapter 8. Closing reflection. You have come a long way in this audiobook. Not because you have solved something. Not because all the difficult things have been resolved, or the patterns have disappeared, or the inner life has been tidied into something neat and manageable. That is not what has happened here. What has happened is simpler than that. And more important, you have practiced looking at yourself. You have practiced staying with what you see rather than moving away from it. You have practiced the beginnings of acceptance, the beginnings of responsibility, the beginnings of the kind of honesty with yourself that makes everything else possible. These are not small things, even if they feel small. Even if the voice inside you is saying that you already knew all of this, that nothing here was really new, that you understand all of it in theory and the real difficulty is in the practice. That voice is right about the last part. The real difficulty is in the practice. But practice begins somewhere. And somewhere is better than nowhere. You have been somewhere. You are somewhere right now. And there is something worth acknowledging before we close. Something that is true about you, even if it is difficult to receive. The fact that you are here, that you chose to spend this time with something that asked you to look at yourself honestly, rather than something that let you look away, says something about you. It says that part of you is ready. Part of you has been ready. Part of you has known for some time that there was work to do and has been waiting for permission to begin. You do not need permission. You never did. But sometimes we need a reminder that the door is there and that walking through it is something we are capable of. You are capable of this. You are capable of more honesty than you have been giving yourself, more awareness, more responsibility, more genuine change. Not because you are exceptional in some abstract sense, but because you are a human being with the capacity for real self-reflection, and that capacity is one of the most powerful things a person has access to. It does not matter how long you have been avoiding. Avoidance is not a verdict. It is a pattern, and patterns can change. It does not matter how many times you have been here before, at this edge of a decision to do something differently, and turned back. The fact that you have been here before does not diminish the fact that you are here now. The present is where change lives, not in the regret of the past or the hope of the future, but in this moment, this choice, this instance of honest attention. What comes next is not complicated. It is simple, though not easy. Continue to look. When the urge to look away is strong, notice it, and look anyway. Not past the discomfort, but through it. At what is on the other side. Continue to stay. When something true surfaces and the instinct is to immediately cover it or rush past it, pause. Let it be there. Let it be real for long enough to be workable. Continue to accept. Not everything about yourself needs to stay, but everything about yourself needs first to be acknowledged. Let the difficult truths take up the space they actually occupy. Stop spending energy trying to make them smaller. Continue to take responsibility for what is yours, for the patterns that are yours to change. Not for everything, not with excessive guilt, but with the honest clarity of someone who knows that they have a real role in their own life. And continue to be honest with yourself, not brutally, not harshly, but consistently, with the kind of steady truthfulness that does not require drama or crisis, just a quiet ongoing commitment to seeing clearly. This is the work, not a project with an end date, a practice with no end date, a relationship with yourself that you will be building and refining for as long as you are alive. And it is worth it, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it asks more of you than you feel capable of giving, even when the patterns seem resistant and the change seems slow and the honest version of yourself feels painfully different from the version you have been presenting to the world. It is worth it, because on the other side of this work, accumulated through countless small moments of honest attention, is something that cannot be found any other way. A life that is actually yours, not the life you have been managing, not the life you have been performing, not the life organized around the avoidance of certain feelings or the maintenance of certain stories. The real one, the full one, the one that includes all of you. You can avoid yourself for a long time. Most people do, but not forever. And the moment you choose to face what is real, the moment you stop moving away and turn toward, the moment you look at the thing you have been avoiding and let yourself really see it, is the moment your life begins to change, not all at once, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else might even notice at first. But it begins, and that beginning is everything. It is the only beginning there is. It is yours.